Hi, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Representative Carla Drenner, and Chairwoman Dempsey is caught in traffic, and I am going to go ahead and convene the meeting. So the first speaker on today's agenda is Christy Kuryatnik.
Can you see the presentation? Okay. Okay, well, good afternoon. I am delighted to be here in person this time. Christy Kuryatnik, and I am the director of the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program and Healthy Homes Programs for the Department of Public Health. And I am going to get started. So last time I presented at the last meeting, I talked a little bit about our program, touched briefly on some of the things that we do. So this time I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the home inspection process and then talk a little bit about the enforcement that we do. And this slide, will you all be able to see the slides? I'm not seeing the slides come up.
It's not you.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so like I was saying, I was going to dive a little deeper into the home inspection process that DPH does for children who have lead poisoning. And this particular slide was a slide from the last presentation that I gave. So it's a great place to jump off and talk about this. So this is just a recap, excuse me, and just as a reminder, the EBL stands for elevated blood lead, or an EBLL, elevated blood lead level, or you'll hear me refer to a child as an EBL child, which is a lead poison child. So the home investigation process occurs when the child is first tested, and then the lab reports to our office. The child is identified as an EBL, and his information is entered into SENS database if the level is at or above 10 micrograms per deciliter. This child is referred to a regional coordinator for the environmental investigation in the child's home. The regional coordinator does the investigation, and then reports are generated and submitted into SENS database and sent to recipients such as the caregivers, the medical providers, and the landlords if the child's in a rental property. And if hazards are found, the hazards are then mitigated. And we continue to monitor the child for subsequent blood lead levels, because the only way we know if those corrections are working is by monitoring the child's blood afterwards and making sure that the lead levels do come down. So we use HUD Chapter 16 as a protocol for EBL children. And HUD Chapter 16 basically gives us guidance in order for us to focus on, and when I say us, I'm talking about both we at the state office and also our regional coordinators at the local offices. We work in tangent together as a team to provide services for the children. So, but anyway, HUD Chapter 16 allows us to focus on lead hazards within the immediate environment of the child. The investigator is obligated to conduct a comprehensive investigation of all sources of lead in the child's environment, inclusive of all spaces and dwellings, including all non-traditional sources of exposure. So the investigator tests deteriorated paint on furniture, dust on old window blinds, and any object identified as a potential source of exposure to the child. And there are no restrictions on the number of sources that can be tested. So HUD Chapter 16 gives us a wonderful questionnaire form that we can use. And the questionnaire form in the family interview lets us discuss with the family about the child's behaviors and specifically about that particular home the child lives in. The interview and the visual inspection of the home leads the assessor to sample possible lead sources in the home. And I think one of the most important things here is to say that the lead home investigation is child-centric, which is meaning that when the investigator is in the home, she has to look at all of the possible lead sources according to what the child would see through the child's eyes. So as I was saying, the visual investigation and talking to the family would lead the investigator to make thoughtful guesses as to where they need to sample. And each home, of course, is different. So the sampling processes would be different for each home. And we sample the house paint, and we use the XRF lead analyzer to sample the lead paint, the house paint. And then that picture over on the far right shows a XRF lead analyzer. And in this particular picture, it's doing a soil sample, which XRF can be used on paint or soil. The lead analyzers are expensive to purchase. They are probably around $20,000 to $25,000 each to purchase, and they have to be maintained. They have a radioactive isotope source in them that has to be replaced as it continues to degrade over time, and it has to be replaced every 3 to 7 years depending on the brand. So the XRFs also must be licensed with the Department of Natural Resources, and the folks that use them must be certified by completing a certification course. We sample soil, drip lines. The drip line is the perimeter of the house, and it's called the drip line because that's where old lead-based paint can be washed down around the home perimeter. And of course, the play areas of the child, and we find the play areas through the interview process. We also sample water. We want to try and get that first catch of water because water will sit in the lead pipes or sit in the pipes, not necessarily lead pipes, but sit in the pipes overnight. So we want to get that first catch. We take that sample at the primary source for drinking, which is normally the kitchen faucet. So sampling the water can be a little expensive. It can be upwards towards $40 to have that analyzed in the lab. So we also can take dust wipe samples as well. Dust wipes must be lab analyzed. And there's a little picture down on the very bottom there with the gloved hand, has a dust wipe, and they're wiping a floor within a template. So those little dust wipes get poked into a test tube and sent off to the lab to be analyzed. So it's also the way that we do post-abatement clearances. using dust wipe sampling. So some of the common exposure sources that we found include, of course, old paint, plastic coloring, especially with blinds and toys, keys and other metals, cosmetics like Surma and Kohl. Those are cosmetics that are imported from other countries, and folk remedies. And I'm just going to touch on these because you have a wonderful presentation coming up later that will go through some of these things in more depth. Imported candies, specifically from Mexico, jewelry from other countries, the cheaper jewelry where they put lead into it for stability, batteries, of course, lead bullets and sinkers, and I think everyone knows those are pretty much mostly lead. In occupations and hobbies, for example, families that would work or parents that would work at a battery factory could get lead dust on their clothing and bring that home to the child and expose the child that way. But interestingly enough, we've not found any EBL children with an exposure due to drinking water. So the services that the child get basically depend on the lead level that they have, that they present with. So if we have lead levels under 5 micrograms per deciliter, that is basically up to the medical provider and his discretion or her discretion as to whether or not they need to retest, or if they need to retest and when they need to do it. If a child presents with a lead level between 5 and 9, we recommend that the blood be tested within a year and hopefully within 3 months. And we will provide educational material to parents for every elevated test, regardless of the confirmation. If we find a child between 5 and 9 who has a confirmed EBL, and remember, confirmed from my last presentation means 1 venous or 2 capillary tests taken within 3 months apart. So if they present with that between 5 and 9, we will contact the parents directly for consultation. The child presents with an EBL at 10 micrograms per deciliter to 19 micrograms per deciliter. Then we refer that case to the regional coordinator. The regional coordinator will provide information to the parents on lead poisoning cause and effect, environmental lead hazard reduction, and nutrition. She will also provide information on WIC services, Children's First, and children's medical services if it's appropriate for the family. The regional coordinator will also arrange that the child have an in-home investigation within 2 weeks of receiving the referral from our office. The regional coordinator then provides a summary of the assessment and makes recommendations and gives that to the caregivers, the property owners, medical providers, and provides us with a copy. So if the child presents between 20 and 44 micrograms per deciliter, the risk assessment should occur within 1 to 2 weeks of receiving the referral from our office. And they're provided with the same services. If a child has an EBL between 45 and 69 micrograms per deciliter, the risk assessment should occur within 48 hours of receiving the referral. If a child presents with a lead level at 70 or greater, 70 micrograms per deciliter or greater, we consider that a medical emergency, and that child should be in the hospital and chelation processes should be starting on that child. The risk assessment should occur within 24 hours of receiving the referral. And if the child must go into different housing unit post-chelation, the regional coordinator will inspect the new unit for lead hazards and inform medical provider that the home is lead safe prior to the child's release from the hospital. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the enforcement. So our current law says that upon determination that a child less than 6 has a confirmed lead poisoning, the child resides in, attends, or regularly visits a dwelling, a school, or a daycare, and that facility has lead hazards, DPH shall require a lead hazard abatement, including any supplemental addresses that the child might be spending time in. So for dwellings, this applies only to the owners of residential rental property or the landlords. And when abatement is required, the owner or managing agent shall submit a written lead poisoning hazard abatement plan to DPH within 14 days. And I have 30 days up here in red, only because it's more realistic time frame, because the landlord has to work with a lead contractor in order to write that plan and submit it to us. The abatement contractor must work with the manager, the owner manager, to write the plan, and if the plan has not been submitted within 14 days, DPH will issue an abatement order. If the order is ignored, then DPH will solicit a court order and take legal action. The removal of children from the dwelling, school, or daycare facility shall not constitute abatement if the property continues to be used for a dwelling, school, or daycare facility. And we've had issues with that one. Just because a child is removed from the home does not mean that the lead hazards have gone away. And so, some landlords think that, because they remove the family, the child's no longer there, there's no longer a problem. But of course, we know we need to deal with the lead paint hazards that are there. So the enforcement process is really a collaboration between my office and the regional lead coordinators at the local offices. So the local responsibilities in the process include that they do the risk assessment, that the inspection recommendations are created based upon the findings at the home, that they issue the order to comply with abatement remediation, and then they conduct the post-abatement clearance inspection. And the post-abatement clearance inspection is an inspection that comes in after the contractor is done mitigating the lead paint, just to check and make sure that it has been mitigated and that the house is now clean and safe for the child to go back into. So the state program responsibilities, we review the corrective action plan, and either we approve it or ask for alterations to it. We prepare and send enforcement letter if there's no plan received. And if the situation gets escalated, then we'll file a case with the Attorney General's office. After the lead abatement work has been completed, and we will receive confirmation from the regional coordinator the home has passed clearance. And so in these last few slides, I've got some things for the committee to consider. And these are just some things that need updating, to update some of the outdated science and to clarify some of the language. So dropping the state definition of a confirmed EBL level to 5 micrograms per deciliter, which is the CDC recommendation. I know we've talked about this in the last presentation, that there's a population of children that we're just missing their services. The capability for us to provide services to those children is not there. Dropping the state level of 10 micrograms per deciliter for an environmental home investigation to 5 micrograms per deciliter, which again is a CDC recommendation. Striking the definition of persistent EBL, just because it really is not necessary to have there. An EBL is an EBL is an EBL. It's pretty much covered under the confirmed definition. Adding the term exterior to the definition of dwelling or dwelling unit, because I think we all know that the child can become poisoned outside of the house just as well as inside of the house if there's lead-based paint on the exterior of the home. Changing the definition of lead hazard abatement to match the Department of Natural Resources abatement definition for consistency among state agencies. We should have the same exact definition. It serves no purpose to have 2 different definitions. And I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it over yourself. But the first definition there is the DPH definition. Underneath that is the Department of Natural Resource definition. And as you can see, the DNR definition is more descriptive in the abatement process. Change the definition of lead poisoning hazard to meet the current federal standards as defined by the EPA. So currently the dust samples for EPA, the floor is 10 micrograms per square foot. Currently in our law, we have 100. Window seal is 100 micrograms per square foot, and currently in our law, we have 500. So you can see that our numbers are outdated. They're not keeping pace with the science in the federal standards. Adding the definition of a hazard for soil as well, because we know children can get lead poisoning from consuming soil. Adding the definition of 400 parts per million in bare soil in children's play areas and 1,200 parts per million for the rest of the yard, including the drip line. Include the term pregnant woman along with children under 6 years old as a criteria for lead-based paint abatement. Increase the length of time that a landlord must submit an abatement plan to mitigate hazards from 14 days to 30 days, and I already addressed that. Require a post-abatement clearance inspection, not a visual, and this is a big one. The EPA has very strict and stringent standards for how a clearance inspection is supposed to be conducted, and our people at Department of Public Health are trained to those standards. And they require, like I said earlier, dust wipe sampling. In our law right now, it says that we can clear a home after mitigation just visually, and that makes no sense because you can't see lead dust, you know. So really there's room there to correct that. Add the term exclusion to removal or exclusion of children or pregnant women. And I already addressed that earlier in a rental unit. Landlord must submit a letter certifying that the property will no longer be used as a dwelling if that is the intent. So if the landlord's telling us, yes, I have lead hazards in this rental property, however, I'm never going to use this as a dwelling again, I'm going to turn it into a storage building or a commercial building, then they need to certify something and give that to us so that we have that. And if a landlord does not disclose that a home has the potential for lead hazards and hazards are found, tenants can void their lease. And of course, that's to protect the children so that they won't be exposed to any hazards that are in the home. The purpose is to get the child out of the home as soon as possible. And this speaks to the Title 10 disclosure rule from EPA, which makes a landlord, or is supposed to have a landlord tell any tenant that they have lead hazards in the home, if indeed they do find lead hazards in the home. So, and that is it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. Are there any questions, or do we have any questions from anyone who is joining us online?
I don't, but thank
I
you.
believe we're seeing. Thank you. This is wonderful information for us. I appreciate the guidelines and procedures in this succinct manner. And certainly your considerations are very important. Definition, specific language, those ratios, that is something that is certainly in our minds as we go through this. So thank you for this information.
And thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, I believe, and I want to apologize first of all to y'all too for being slightly late. Atlanta traffic can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes. I-75 is pretty well backed up. So we are going to, I believe now join by Zoom, Sarah Visser, the Assistant Branch Chief and Land Division, Georgia Environmental Protection Division. So we'll cue that up.
Hello,
There's
how
a
are y'all
handout
today?
and our information as well.
And I am going to attempt to share my screen. Okay. Let's see here. All right, are y'all able to see that presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you very much for having me. My name is Sarah Visser, and I am the Assistant Chief for Land Protection at the Environmental Protection Division. And I am thrilled to be here to share just a little bit with you today about our lead-based paint program at EPD. So first of all, you heard Christy speak a
Hold
little
on
bit.
just 1 minute.
I'm so sorry.
Turn that again. Tell her that.
IT is on the way. Hold with us just a moment. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no problem.
We're all navigating the challenges that we are trying to work through, and we will work through them as well. I'll take this moment too to thank Representative Drenner as well for filling in for me at the very beginning. I appreciate you. So help is near. Hang with us just a little bit longer. I know this is going to be a very informative presentation from EPD. So for all of you that are watching online and for the archives that are taping us right now, if y'all will just be patient. We're working through some technical difficulties. Okay, we're going to make a little switch here for just a moment and drop down to another presenter while we try to figure out exactly how to make this work. So our next presentation will come from Robert Wheeler and Monique Kramer. Robert works with is the retired lead regional coordinator, and Ms. Kramer is the Atlanta Metro Area Lead Regional Coordinator, and I believe on the DeKalb County Board of Health is who y'all are representing. So before we get started, why don't you take a minute and tell us a little about yourself as well, and if you'll wait just a minute, I'm going to get your microphones working, I think. I'm going to turn on the table and the podium, maybe. Let's see. Okay, we're ready
Can
to
you
go.
hear me?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for having us. My name is Bob Wheeler. I've been working in the lead inspection division since 1998. And along the way, I have collected a few items of lead exposure, and that's what I'm here to present to you today. You good? Oh, y'all can see that? Okay. Most important slide I have is the first one. Lead is everywhere. It's a naturally occurring element. It's very abundant, and things like soil can be a source of lead poisoning in children. We'll get right into this if that's okay. Next slide. And the next slide, please. Here are some of the sources of lead. You get paint, toys, spices, jewelry. Just have a bunch of them listed there. Next slide. We'll start with paint. I have here a couple of samples of paint. And because that's been a major source of lead poisoning in children through the years. These particular ones are very high. This one is 21,000 parts per million lead, and that's in the paint that was on the house. We can go to the next slide. These are some pictures of painted houses with lead. In some cases, like this one, the lead paint was painted over with latex, and the latex peels off in big pieces. Lead paint it's called alligatoring. Am I saying that right? It comes off in small chunks and they're thick. And when a child chews on them, they actually like the taste. They will peel that paint off and eat it. Next slide. Here's some more of the leaded paint we've come across. Next. And some more. And next. This is a house that was recently painted, but the lead paint is still there. It's hard to see in the slide, but the latex paint over the lead paint does not get rid of the lead source. It's still there. Next. Other sources of lead paint of lead other than paint: ceramic tile, car keys, jewelry, vinyl blinds, tools, medicines, toys, kitchenware, batteries, candy, fishing sinkers, bullets, spices, hobbies such as stained glass. Next, we'll start with some vinyl blinds. I've only brought one set that we had, and it's this one. And this is because it was the highest level of lead we got off vinyl blinds. In this case, well, we're most interested in the dust, and the stool on the window under the vinyl blinds. The lead amount was 921 micrograms per foot squared, which is well above the action level, which I think Christy said has changed. It used to be 250. The floor was 137 micrograms per foot squared, which the action level, you have to do something. That's what the action level is. It was 40, and in this case, it was 137 with these, in this house with these blinds. Next. That's just some vinyl blinds we took a picture of. Next. Yes, ma'am.
To a question. So when you say dust, are you talking about just household dust that was on the blind, or is the blind coming apart under there?
Yes to both.
Okay, so it can absorb it.
As you up and down, move the blinds up and down, it comes off slightly, just wear and tear ever so slightly, and it collects. In this particular case, the family just wasn't cleaning up as well as maybe some people do. So it took a while for it to get to that level. But the children still love that window to look out, and that's where they were getting their lead.
And is that in blinds that are manufactured now too as
No.
well? No, okay.
These are older blinds.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Car keys, easily 70–80% of all car keys we tested have lead in them. We had a case where they put a whole bunch of old keys in the crib and the child sucked on them all day. And that was the source of the lead. They are phasing lead out of them, but I'm still finding lead in a lot of keys. Next. More car. Gripe water. We found several medications that have lead in them. Gripe water manufactured in the US, we've not found lead in, but a lot of gripe water manufactured outside the US, we have found lead in. And they give it to children to help with colic and possibly a few other things. Next. Jewelry. We find a lot of lead and a lot of jewelry. I have several examples here of leaded jewelry. These both are bracelets. And that is an anklet. And this bracelet here, I would like to discuss for a second, just because of the case involved. This child, I don't know if Dr. Geller is listening to us or not. We had to have that child put in the hospital and had chelation. But as I'm bringing up the jewelry, this ended up not being the source, although it was highly leaded. In that case, the mom kept returning to Mexico, and the child was getting the lead from lead paint, or from leaded paint. And I'm bringing that one up only because that's the only child under my watch that was put in the hospital and chelated. And that was Dr. Geller's by his suggestion. Next. Oh, the jewelry I have here is shown there. This one here is the one on the slide. Next. That is this one. Next. Oh, that's all that jewelry. Knobs, handles. Older furniture, the knobs on them sometimes have lead in them. And we have gone in and we've seen kids, we'll be talking to mom, and I've actually seen a child just have her mouth right on the knob of a dresser, and it just sucks on it. This particular set here was in a kitchen and was the ultimate source of lead in this lead poisoning case. Next, ceramics. We find lead in a lot of, excuse me, sorry. We find lead in a lot of ceramics. This plate, that's a knob, I'll come back to that. A lot of plates like this have lead in them, like that. We've run across some plates made in Mexico that literally said on the back of them, for display only, because they have so much lead in them. But ceramics usually are not a source of lead unless they're broken, like this. This came off a cup, and I just have it. I just brought it because it's a broken piece, and the dust off of it was much higher than the actual test that we originally made on the product. So you have to be careful around them, but if they're intact, they're not such a bad thing. Here's some of our ceramic bowls, and like I say, the handle off the cup and their lead levels. Next, buttons. One case, I've only had one case only, but the child had a very high lead level of lead, and here are the buttons. It came off an old jacket that the grandmother had given to mom, and she wore it and she ate one of the buttons. So it can be a source. Like I said, it only happened once. Next, pottery. We have found a lot. I only have a few examples here, but we found a lot of lead in a lot of pottery. A couple of stories. This one here is a bean pot used. A lot of people from Mexico still use these. You can see the burn part on it. Mom was actually cooking in it the day I went out there. And once I removed it as a source, after we tested and found out it was a source of lead, we removed it. 3 or 4 weeks later, the child tested 0. It went down that fast. Most cases, it doesn't go down that fast. This was interesting. These are all pottery. This is a toy set that mom bought her child, and it was all broken, and she played with it all the time, and that gave her high lead. Next, I think that, that's part of the toy. This is the one we actually saw her chewing on in her mouth, and that's on that slide there. Next, and that's more the same set. Next, spices. 2 of them are more hideous, or 3 of them I consider hideous sources of lead. Spices, most of these are from India. This particular one, I ran down the source of it. The people were buying it from a manufacturer in, I hope I pronounce this right, Dindigul, India, and they were getting it in bulk. This particular this is turmeric, and it is 1,318 parts per million lead. Another spice is called sambar. We found the source of this was in Bangalore, India, and it is 163 parts per million lead. This turmeric from another source in India, 873 parts per million lead. As a side, we tested many manufacturers of turmeric from US sources, two that come to mind, McCormick and Kirkland's and others, and we never found lead in any US labeled manufactured turmeric, just to let y'all know. These were all bulk bought from India. The slide shows you, well, let's go back, please. The slide shows you a turmeric. It's a rhizome, which is like a root. Three possible sources of lead in the turmeric are dirt, because it is a root. Next slide. I was actually told some people add lead trioxide to the turmeric to change its color. It makes it brighter, sells better. And then also the lead may come into the turmeric during the manufacturing process. Next. Makeup. Hang on, please. Okay, we'll forget that one. Makeup, as Christy pointed out, it comes in, lead comes in some makeups. Most of the makeup we found lead in was eye makeup, and the kajal and charcoal and one other I can't think of, they actually will put it in the child's eye. I saw them do it. I don't understand it, but it goes in there and it is absorbed into the system that way. We found a lot of lead in children through that. Next. Oh, that is one of the, that's the kajal. It comes in a very small little bottle. Next. Medications. Oh, when I started finding this stuff, I was appalled. All these are manufactured outside the US. I cannot pronounce this one very well. It's Badyaneth. I don't know, but it comes in a tablet. I'm not really sure what it's used for, but they give it to the children. This particular tablet, which is breaking apart and you can't see it, has 40 parts per million lead. This one I have. I actually have several different examples of this particular one. I've gotten it from the families. It is called, no, I'm sorry, I don't have it written on here and I can't read this. Go to the next slide. Maybe it's on the next slide. Oh, no, it's not there. Oh, it's called Balgudi Kasara or Kasaria. And these particular ones, this particular one is 2,820 parts per million, and they give them directly to the children. It's in some of the families, it was hard to get them to stop doing it. Next, in the Hispanic Latino communities, 2 home remedies they give the children, azacarn, and I'm not pronouncing that right, I'm sure, and Greta. I don't have examples of those, but all the ones I've tested have been high in lead. Next. I know I had that one. Well, go to the next slide. Maybe it's on there. There it is. And then go back. And now go back. This medication is another medication from the Middle East. I don't want to try to pronounce it, but that was 12,600 milligrams per kilogram lead. It's just very high in lead. Next. And that's the bottle it came in. Next. And there's the ball goody. Next. Candy. The people that check candy coming to the United States happen to be, for the most part, is the California Public Health Department. And all this candy came from Mexico. This is Tamara Roca. And that warning, it says warning on that came from the California Public Health Department. We got Pope Parindo. But this came out, this was in 2007 is when I got this candy. This one is Tamaroca. And most of these are warnings from the Department of Public Health in California that I have with them. This last one is called Pelo Rico, and I found lead in several of these. It's actually a pop-up candy, and I have my test in here as well as the Department of Public Health in California's test of the lead in them. Every one of these is pre-2010, by the way. It's gotten less and less. You can pull up the California Department of Public Health test on candy on the internet and take a look at it. And every now and then a new candy will pop up with the lead in it. But for the most part, it's been greatly reduced. Next. Oh, they're up there. There they are. Okay. The source for the lead source for the candy is usually one of two things: tamarindo, or it's introduced during the manufacturing process. Next. Under miscellaneous, we found this one time, only time I ever found it, this grinder. It turns out they grinded the spices themselves at home, and we tested the spice before it was ground by them, no lead. And we found out they were grinding it in this, and that's where the lead source was. As they ground it, it absorbed the lead from the grinder itself. Next. Oh, there's the grinder there. Crayons and chalk. This is from 2008. Again, we're finding less and less lead in these items, but this chalk was bought, or it's made in China, and was bought at a company here. It was sold regularly at a company in America, and the crayon. You can't see that, also came from China. And again, we're finding less and less lead in these items. Next. Oh, there's a chalk and crayon there. Next. Tire weights. I find the strangest things in cribs. This tire weight was in the crib, no lead. You can go to the next slide. This tire weight was 43.5 parts per million lead, and the child just loved to suck on it. Why it was in the crib, I don't know, but Dad got rid of it, thank God. Next. Oh, a lot of people from the Middle East, especially India, have shrines or temples in their home. And almost, well, I should say almost every one I've ever tested, the items in the shrine of the temple have lead in them. Not everything there, but there's always something there with lead in it. The children don't have regular access to it, but still we found over time, we'll find lead dust on the table, et cetera. Go to the next slide, please. This is what one of those shrines looked like. Next slide. And this was one of the items we took out of the home. It was high in lead, and the child, I got this because the child was playing with it, even though the parent said the child had no access to the shrine. Next. Sometimes the source of lead is from mom and dad, their employer. The most we found were from gun ranges and battery manufacturers. Battery manufacturer in Lithonia, they have a process where all the people leaving the battery, the plant, have to change clothes there at the plant. Dad would come home. We didn't find much lead until we checked his boots. He didn't change his boots. They were very high in lead, and the car itself had a lot of lead in it. Gun ranges, we've actually dealt with several police officers that had lead problems with the children, and it was from the gun range. There are a lot of gun ranges in and around Atlanta. I was surprised when I looked into that. I usually have a map with me, but I didn't have that today. I'm sorry. Next slide. Okay. Real quick, some things I don't have slides of that are sources other than paint. I just want to bring out mom. We've discussed it could be from mom's milk, dirt, old toys. I am really sorry I don't have any of the old toys with me, but that has hopefully been stopped. But a lot of the old toys, if you go to an antique place, you have to be careful what toys you get. You could have, they could have lead. Ornate shoes and clothing that have sequins, rhinestones. We found lead in those, and they've been the source. Leaded crystal. Only one case that I can recall, leaded crystal was the source of the lead in a child, but it has happened. Ornate belt buckles. Again, we found a little lead here and there, but I found some of the highest lead levels I've ever checked in rodeo belt buckles. Water, it can be the source, although I've only been involved in 2 cases where lead was in the house, in the water pipes, but neither one of those was the actual source of lead in a child. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
Representative.
Thank you. What about Christmas trees?
We found lead in a few old Christmas trees. They used the same material they made for AstroTurf a long time ago. We found lead in that also, but those were, again, they were pre-2010.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out, there's a warning on my Christmas tree that from California that says, that it may have contain lead. So that's why I was asking.
We can test it for you.
Better get a new tree. I know, I can talk to you. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, again, thank you so much. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you so much. It's pretty amazing where all it may be now. So certainly something for us to pay attention to. Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay. Zoom became a challenge. So we are so fortunate to have Sarah Visser here with us. She is the Assistant Branch Chief for the Land Division of Georgia Environmental Protection Division. We do have some handouts in here. And thank you. I'm so sorry for the earlier problem
No
that we
problem
had.
at all. And we work out of 2 offices. Unfortunately, I was just across the street, so I said, "Pull over if that's easier." Thank you.
Thank you so much. Look forward to your presentation. Sarah, when you do get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? Okay, to introduce yourself, please.
In fact, I could start with that. I'm Sarah Visser. I'm the Assistant Branch Chief for Land Protection over at the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. And before that, I was fortunate to meet some of y'all when I was with Keep Georgia Beautiful. I was the executive director there for quite some time. So, but I am very much enjoying this role with EPD. I've been there for about 3 or 4 years now.
Great.
Well, without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our lead-based paint program. So you've heard about a lot of the potential sources of lead in a household. EPD only regulates one of them, and that is lead-based paint. And it's only regulated by us when it is disturbed as part of renovation, repair, painting, or demolition activities. And you can see here a few pictures of some of the most common places we encounter lead paint during that time. And that's in the exterior, interior paint of a house. It's old cabinets, and it's also old windows. And so those are some of the most prevalent places that we see it. Our regulatory program addresses kind of 2 separate areas. The first is licensure and accreditation. So the folks that you've heard from today, you heard Christy talk a little bit about their lead risk assessors and about their lead inspectors. They are all accredited and licensed through this process. But then we also do that for general contractors as well. The second part of that is enforcement and inspection of lead abatement projects and of those renovation, repair, and painting rules. So Georgia's RRP renovation, repair, and painting rule applies when renovations are completed for compensation in residential structures or child occupied facilities built before 1978, because of course, as y'all know, 1978 is the key date for when lead paint is most likely to be present in a structure. And that work disturbs more than 6 square feet of an interior space or 20 square feet of an exterior space. If you're replacing any windows of any size at any time, or for partial demolitions. Work done by individuals and housing they own and occupy is not regulated by this rule. So what that means is that in your own home, when you do the work yourself, you don't have to get a license and you don't have to attend training. We do still require that they comply with work practices and with solid waste regulations. I'm going to show you a little bit of an example a little bit later of kind of what that looks like potentially for a homeowner. Landlords are subject to this rule. So I heard y'all talking about that with DPH earlier. The law presumes that all pre-1978 structures contain lead paint. So for any contractors that are asking themselves the question of, do I need to get certified? The answer is yes. If you are working on pre-1978 structures, the law requires that you be certified. We do 2 things related to that. The first is that we accredit training providers. So everybody has to go to training. That's what we say when we say certified. You pay a fee to get your license, and then you also attend training. So we accredit those training providers. We audit their classes to make sure that they include the important relevant information. And then we also issue the certificates to firms and individuals for the particular type of lead work that you're doing. And you've heard about a couple of those. So risk assessors, inspectors, renovators, supervisors, there's different categories for each of those things that somebody may get their license in. We also maintain a list of those individuals and firms on our website. So for homeowners or members of the public that are looking for somebody who can do that kind of work, that has the appropriate license, they can find that there. So that's one piece. That's that licensure piece. The second piece is that we inspect and enforce those rules and also the abatement project rules. And we do that in a few different ways. Complaints, most often a neighbor, something is happening at the property next door, and they can tell that it doesn't quite look right, it doesn't look compliant, and they will call us. Also through building permit reviews. So this is something that actually is an increasing part of the way we do our work. We try to get copies of building permits from local governments. And then if it's a pre-1978 structure, we can check immediately to see if the contractor that is listed has the appropriate licensure. If they do, that's probably where that ends if we haven't had additional, complaint or something else about the property. But if they don't have that licensure, and in fact, many contractors, we estimate as many as 90% of contractors in the state may not have their lead license, then we would go further and do an inspection and see whether or not work practices are being followed. We have partnerships with local governments, and this is something we're also looking to expand. So we're working more with them through their code enforcement efforts when they are already out in communities, to refer to us tips and complaints, and then also letting them know what to look for. And then also through forays. So we may drive around in communities with a lot of target housing. So for those that are familiar with Atlanta, Virginia Highland, Midtown, Old Fourth Ward, neighborhoods like that with a lot of pre-1978 homes, and look for places where renovation is happening, and then check to see whether or not all of those rules and regulations are being followed. This is a quick snapshot of our enforcement actions for FY21. So we did about 500 inspections across the state, and we issued 224 notices of violation. That means we found a problem that needed to be corrected. Everything from somebody did not have the right licensure, which is probably by far our most common violation, to that they engaged in some kind of prohibited work practice. Like you see the gentleman here is pressure washing what is clearly peeling paint, and has the potential then to spread those paint chips. And I'm going to go back one because I forgot to talk about these pictures. This is a site in Savannah that was issued an NOV. You can see it is a house that is being prepared to be painted. And on the right-hand side, you can see that there are lead paint chips all over the ground. And we know that those are lead paint chips because you can see in the center that one of them has been tested with, we have a swab stick that we use in the field. And, you know, if it turns red, it's lead is the saying that goes along with that. This is an example of a site that, whether it was a contractor or whether it was a homeowner, a notice of violation would have been issued, because even as a homeowner who was doing the work on their own property, they're not permitted to create this kind of lead contamination hazard with all of those chips on the ground. So that one would get a violation either way. And then we have consent orders. So we issued 2 consent orders last year, and that is really when one of these sort of additional enforcement factors is present. There's kind of a bigger issue at play. The first one is risk to children and pregnant women. As I know that this committee has heard, you know, the true risk for lead exposure is really with young children and with pregnant women. And so one of those consent orders, for example, was issued to a daycare that was doing non-compliant work. They had hired somebody who wasn't licensed, and there were work practice issues, meaning there was a potential for children to be exposed to lead at that site. And so that's an example where we would go to that higher level of a consent order. Additionally, if somebody has previous violations, you know, if we've talked to them before and they haven't gone and gotten their license as they should, if there's risk of harm from the violations. So we will always view it more seriously if there are work practice violations. So if somebody does not have a license, but they are still following all of the recommended work practices, we are going to be a little bit more lenient in that situation than somebody that either is licensed or isn't licensed, but is not following those work practices and has created an active hazard. And then additionally, impact to neighboring properties. And so again, you know, to this example of pressure washing, that's a system where those lead chips that he is potentially creating are not going to stay on that property. They're going to wash over to neighboring properties and contaminate those properties as well. In addition to those pieces, we also have a variety of technical assistance, things that are available. We have brochures for homeowners, we have brochures for contractors, lots of information for people on what they should consider, either if they are hiring a contractor or if they're doing the work themselves to keep their families safe. So what do you need to know about lead paint? And then we also have a daily duty officer. And so this is the number to call for folks that want to lodge a complaint, that have questions about the rules and regulations, that have questions about lead paint exposure, and we can refer folks to the appropriate contacts either at Department of Public Health or at the Environmental Protection Agency, the US EPA, when their questions go outside of our scope. And that's what I have for y'all. So then I just would ask if you have any questions.
Are there any questions? Yes, Representative Drenner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure if you're the appropriate person to ask this to. Do you happen to know when you sell a piece of property that was built prior to 1978, if any of the disclosure paperwork is there a lead question on there that you have to answer?
Yes. So it is a federal requirement that when you sell residences prior to 1978, that there is a lead paint disclosure that goes along with that. I actually live in a condo from 1924, and I got one when I bought my condo. There's a form that you sign as a part of the mortgage process. And then even if you went through a cash deal that didn't involve a bank, you would also have to be given that form and a copy of one of the publications that comes from EPA that is about lead exposure. Now, we don't regulate that particular piece, but that is a federal requirement.
Okay.
I have a question.
Representative Gamble.
What is, for someone that's in violation and is cited, and I apologize, we're all on a journey to learn about this. What is the fine? What would that look like for, just say, a contractor that was performing work and didn't have the certification?
Yeah.
What would that look like?
So at the beginning, there is no fine. Our biggest concern at EPD is bringing people into compliance. We want you to do the things you are supposed to do, and we want to help you do that. So our first step, when you get that notice of violation letter, it tells you all of the things you need to correct in order to not have a fine or to not have it go any further. And often, unfortunately, we find out about these issues on properties after the fact. So for example, when we pull building permits, that might have happened last month, 2 months ago. That work might already be finished. And in that case, our only notice of violation, because we can't observe work practices on the site, might be that that person does not have the appropriate licensure. And then we're going to work with them to get that licensure. So it starts out with nothing. Come into compliance. We want to help you. We want to get everybody back where they need to be. After that, if somebody does not come into compliance, then the fine is specific to the violation and specific to, I talked about some of those enforcement factors, like, is there a child occupied facility involved? So for example, somebody who was not licensed that had done work on a child occupied facility like a daycare or a school that was occupied with children in it, they might face a fine of $1,500 or $2,000 for that single violation. There might be additional violations that went along with it, versus somebody who did work on an unoccupied single family house. They might be fined, $150, $250. So it really depends on the scope of the violation. And also those work practice violations are always much higher in nature than the licensure violation, because we want to make sure that the work that's happening is safe. And we have a workbook that we use to determine that, so that our inspectors can kind of go down the line and choose the circumstances that apply.
And y'all oversee that certification process, and so
Yes.
I would come to you for the.
So what you would do is you would go to a private third-party trainer.
Mhm.
You would take their class, and then you would submit documentation to us that you had taken the class,
Okay.
and then we would issue you a license. And you would also pay again, the fee varies, but it's $100, $300,
Mhm.
something like that. You would also pay a fee as part of that licensure with the
Okay,
state.
and is that annually or just one time?
So you go one time for the big training
Mhm.
that is going to be, longer in duration. And then you have to renew that with a refresher course on an annual basis.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I believe online also, Representative Maynard has a question.
Sure.
Hi, thank you. I have a question. If a property has
Okay, wait just a
al-
minute. We're bringing you in.
Oh.
We hope. Try now, Representative Maynard.
testing,
Great. We got you.
okay, thanks. If a property has already been renovated and it was not done by someone certified, can someone still report that? Because one of the things in my communities that I've noticed, a home will be renovated, and after the fact, once the person moves in, then they're being told, you know what, the people renovated this house did not follow proper procedure. What can the new homeowner or even renter do at that point?
Yes, so I would recommend that they give us a call. We can still issue a violation to somebody that did not have their license that did that work. So it is still possible for somebody to receive a notice of violation in that instance. And then we also could refer them to third parties that might be able to test the home and make sure that everything was safe at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question from Dr. Rustin.
So trying to figure out how to turn my camera around.
We have your voice, so that's really good.
All right, we'll just go with my voice. Again, I apologize for not being there in person. I didn't want to bring a summer cold to the group, so I thought I'd stay home today. One question that I have, early in your presentation, you had mentioned EPD regulates lead when it involves renovation. But my question is around public drinking water sources. Is there a different division within EPD that regulates lead in drinking water sources?
There is, and I'm so glad you asked me that question because that is something that I know the committee may hear about later. But that is out of the water branch at EPD. And so you would want somebody from the water branch to come and speak more specifically to that issue. But yes, you are right. It is regulated in drinking water, and somebody else from the water protection branch could speak to that.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. I had a question when you were showing the slide with the paint chips and you had the swab stick.
Yes.
So is that something that an average person can get a hold of to check their paint as well?
Yes, you can buy those at any hardware store. Sells those swabs, and they work just like the ones that we use in the field where they turn red. Now you might want, it's great if you have a particular place that you suspect there is lead paint and you want to test it. So for example, I said I live in a condo from 1924. I know there's lead paint on our windows. I have no doubt whatsoever. And if I wanted to test that, then I could get one of those swabs and I could check that. If you are unsure of the source of potential lead contamination in your home, then you would want to hire somebody who could come out and was an expert and could check that for you. But if you have just an item that you're interested in checking, if you have a child's toy or if you have a section of paint in your home that you wanted to test, you could use one of those swabs. Now, one of those swabs will discolor what it touches. So
Permanently. Okay.
So you do want to be careful in using that.
So it could be used on toys. What about jewelry or any of the other things that we've also heard about? I mean, can that be?
I
used on
would let one of these folks maybe speak to that, but
pottery
but
or
certainly
China
those swabs can be used on different kinds of materials. I don't know the full list that they can be used
I
on.
know as we are starting to learn about this, I sense from everybody, we want to check out some things
Yeah.
probably that we're all living with. I think it's going to become acutely part of what we're curious about. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. And thank you particularly for dashing right over. and
No
making
problem. Glad to
we
do
had
it.
that. Mhm. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. There is one more.
Chair, just a comment to you. I'm going home to clean my blinds.
Okay. Why don't you? I'm going to tell you what, why don't you make sure you check the date on them too? Let's find out when they were made. Great. We're all going to do a little extra cleaning, I'm sure, after this. Cause I lived in a home. I've already told y'all my home was built in 1900. I live in one that was built maybe a little earlier than that, even right now, but particularly in the one that was 1900, I know it was there and I was not aware. So I'm so grateful that I raised two children that are adults and seemed to be okay, because this was just not in the purview at the time. And the paint stayed on forever until it decided to peel off. You're absolutely right. Okay, so I believe now that we are going to try and make it work, I'm sure. Another presentation, and that will be from Beverly Campbell and Bonnie Moras. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Ms. Campbell is with the National Environmental Solutions, Inc., and Ms. Moras with Leadnology, Inc. When y'all speak, if you would take just a moment and make sure to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about what you do. And hang on 1 minute. We're close, close, close. Okay, we have the slides loaded.
Can you see the presentation?
We can, and we can hear you too. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay. My name is Beverly Campbell. Bonnie is not able to join us today. She is actually training, so I am solo. But I am an environmental consultant. So our company, National Environmental Solutions, specializes in testing. We do design, we do project oversight, implementation of designs. We design either how materials are going to be managed in place or how they might be removed. We do clearance testing for reoccupancy. So after a project is completed, we go in and do clearance testing to make sure that it is safe. And we do this for all types of hazardous materials, asbestos, lead, mold, mildew, PCBs, whatever it might be. So we have a lot of experience in the lead industry. We have been asked today to focus on remediation as it applies to lead abatement and some of the rules and regulations that we have in place currently to make sure that remediation efforts are done in a manner that reduces lead exposure. And of course, we focus on children. So when we're talking about remediation with lead, we're talking about the removal of that from an environment and or the control of lead hazards that might be identified. And I know you, the committee obviously is very aware of how legislation works, but I wasn't exactly sure who all was going to be listening. So, and regulations can be kind of tricky sometimes and boring. So, you know, when we start with regulations and when we started with this program, obviously the bill is first introduced to the House and the Senate. Once it's approved, the president signs it into law, and then these statutes are published in the Federal Register. These Federal Register, what we call the Code of Federal Regulations, all of our bodies of regulations have basic three parts. We have the preamble, which I encourage everybody to read. If you're going to look at any of these regulations in depth, this is where you get the history of the regulation. Then you have the regulatory, the body of the regulation. This is where you get the meat and bones of it. And then of course the appendices, which are some are mandatory, some are recommendations. Our regulations started in 1992 with Title 10. This was an EPA mandate that stated that everybody needed to get together and promulgate some rules and regulations to make sure that lead hazards were being reduced and that work was being done effectively in the field, worker protection and protecting of the housing stock, the housing market. So Title 10 basically broke down into, we've got HUD, we've got the federal EPA, and then of course we have OSHA for worker protection. HUD is really the guiding documents that we've got. This HUD guidelines that were published in 1995 and then updated in 2012. This really gave us our methodologies for our industry. This document tells us in the industry how to go about doing a lead-based paint inspection. This tells us, you know, we as lead inspectors have to use that XRF instrument that Christy was showing you a picture of. We are not allowed to use the chemical spot test checks, the ones that turn red, that Ms. Visser was just explaining to you about. We have to use the XRF instrument. Contractors are allowed to use those chemical spot tests in the field because it is basically tells you if there is lead present. It doesn't give you a numerical value of it. But most of our regulations refer back to that HUD guideline. It's probably the oldest one that we've got. And then we've got obviously OSHA, worker protection. But the biggest one that we talk about in our industry is going to be the EPA 745 rule. This is for any housing that is not federally funded and that is not HUD. And within that EPA regulation, we have the definitions of what a lead hazard is. And I believe you guys have all heard from doctors regarding exposures to lead dust levels. This is where you get that definition. This is where we get our lead renovation, repair, and painting. This was a federal mandate adopted by Georgia in our state. Not all states have adopted their own state program, but it is a federal regulation. This is also where you have that real estate disclosure requirement that somebody was asking about. In this real estate disclosure requirement, any property being sold that was built prior to 1978, you must tell that potential buyer, hello, there might be lead-based paint in this home, and you have to give them an adequate amount of time in order to inspect it to determine if there is lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards present. In this regulation, we also have the definition for our lead-based paint activities. This is where we get the definition of who an inspector and a risk assessor is, a worker, a designer, and a supervisor, and the requirements for those different disciplines within the industry. And so Title X had all of these agencies come together, and they're working, they're doing it. They're all working diligently to try and lower lead exposures. But remember, this is a federal mandate, so we do have state and local programs that might be a little bit more strict. Like obviously Georgia has a great lead-based paint program with some good enforcement out there. And then we've got some local communities that have even more strict regulations. Athens, Clark County, Savannah, those even have a little bit more strict regulations than what the state has as a whole. So in looking at how we evaluate lead hazards in the industry and how we control those lead hazards, it starts with the inspection process. So the first thing that we do is an inspection. Based on that inspection, we may conduct a risk assessment where we assess any risk associated with that lead-based paint. This is where we look at lead dust levels. This is where we look to see friction impact surfaces. Where are areas where lead-based paint may be breaking down and generating that lead dust? Once we determine the presence of lead-based paint and we assess the risk associated with that lead-based paint, then we design how we're going to manage it. Are we going to do abatement, full abatement, where we remove the lead-based paint in its entirety? Or are we going to do what's called an interim control, where we manage that lead-based paint in place in a lead-safe state? We try very hard in our industry to give homeowners options that are reasonably financially reasonable for them to do. And not everybody can replace the siding on a house that has lead-based paint on it. So we try and give them options to where we can make it lead safe. And then obviously we do have the renovation, repair, and painting rule, which Ms. Visser gave a lot of details on regarding who that applies to. It's basically any contractor that's going to do work in any target housing or child occupied facilities, making sure those contractors are using lead safe work practices. We do have a lot of contractors that still need to get up to speed on this, but the state's working hard to get that done. And then within all of these programs, within all of these regulations, we have a lot of quality control measures in place, a lot of checks and balances for our industry. We have training and certification. All training and certification for the different disciplines must be done through accredited training providers. And like Ms. Visser was saying, the fees apply the same to training providers as they do to contractors. So as a training provider, if I'm holding a class of 40 students and I forget to mention something, my fee increases versus if I was holding a class for 3 students, making sure that it is at a direct relation to how many students we may be exposing. Very similar to how they handle the contractors. We also have our health-based standards in place for our workers, making sure that workers that are handling lead-based paint are being protected properly. We have accreditations for our laboratories, and then we have our local regulations from the states that are monitoring this. And Ms. Visser already went through a lot of this in Georgia, so I don't really need to repeat it, but focusing really on our industry focuses heavily on those target houses and those child occupied facilities. And again, it all refers back to HUD. If anybody has not had a chance to take a look at these HUD guidelines, this is really where we get all of our documented methodologies. This is the original one that really explains all of the processes for building a containment, how to build a containment, how to keep the general population out of your work area, how to control your dust, the clearance criterias and the clearance standards. Like Christy was saying earlier, lead dust is invisible. You cannot see it. You have to take a sample and have it analyzed by a laboratory in order to determine if there is lead on a surface, especially with the levels that we define as a lead hazard. You know, the current definition of a lead hazard is 10 micrograms. So, you know, the way that we teach this in class is a penny weighs 2 grams. So if you take a penny and cut it into 2 million pieces, that's a microgram. So 10 of those little pieces on a surface is how we define a lead hazard. It's very, very, very small amounts. But this document walks you through all of those processes. Now, HUD doesn't call it the same as all the other regulatory agencies. They call it the Lead Safe Housing Rule. And their involvement for what you have to do on their properties, again, is a direct relation to how much money you're receiving. So the greater the funding from HUD, the more strict they become with their lead regulations. And just to clarify, when we're talking about lead-based paint is the definition, the true definition is any paint, varnish, or shellac. So, you know, we put lead in hardwood floors as a drying agent. We would put it in the varnish on hardwood floors to help it dry faster. So we're not just talking about the paint on the outside of a house. This is any paint, varnish, or shellac that contains lead in excess of 1 milligram per square centimeter, 0.5% by weight, or 5,000 parts per million. Now, all of those numbers are mathematically the same concentration. It's just how you test that painted surface is how you get that number. So the 1 milligram per square centimeter is through the lab, the XRF analyzer. And then the 0.5% by weight or 5,000 parts per million is with a paint chip analysis from a lab. Also, keeping in mind that we do not have lead-free paint currently. Consumer Product Safety Commission does allow lead to still be in paint, even on residential properties. It just may not be by definition lead-based paint. So it can still contain up to 90 parts per million of lead. And again, these numbers only apply to housing. We still use lead-based paint in commercial and industrial settings. All of these regulations only apply to that target housing and that child-occupied facility. And just to reiterate, the definition of a target house, we're targeting those houses that were built prior to 1978 because lead-based paint was banned for residential uses in 1978. With the exception of, we do have exceptions to that, we do not regulate housing that is designated for the elderly, and we do not regulate housing specifically designated for people with disabilities. And we do not regulate 0-bedroom dwellings. So we don't regulate the studio apartments or the college dorms or our military barracks. Those are all excluded from our regulations unless they become a child occupied facility. So again, all of our regulations are focusing on kids. Our kids don't spend all of their time at home. So we also look at what we define as a child occupied facility. And the definition of that for the federal standard is under the age of 6. Here in Georgia, we did include the 6-year-old. So our regulations say 6 and under. They have to go to that particular site twice a week for 3 hours a time or 6 hours a week. And if your facility falls under that category, then you are a child occupied facility. So to give you an example, several years ago, we did work in an assisted living facility. It was built in the 60s. Technically, our lead-based paint rules don't apply to it because it was designated for the elderly. However, this facility did allow children to spend the afternoons there with their grandparents after school until mom and dad got off of work, and that activity through this assisted living center into a child occupied facility, making sure that we're focusing on those kids. And of course, a lot of our regulations, like Ms. Visser said, especially in Georgia, we focus on renovation work because we know that traditional renovation activities create lead dust, and we know that lead dust is a lead hazard. So this comes straight out of the HUD guidelines. Basically, what they're saying here is that if you took a 1 square foot area in a work area, 1 square foot of a painted surface, and that 1 square foot area was painted with the definition of lead-based paint at 1 milligram per square centimeter, which is a very low concentration. And you spread that dust out over a 10 foot by 10 foot area over 100 or equivalent to 100 square feet, you would have over 9,000 micrograms of dust on that surface. And we define a lead hazard as anything greater than 10 micrograms. So in our industry, we focus very heavily on dust, making sure that all dust stays in our work area, and we don't have work areas where there's hazards that look like this photograph here. We already have a lot of things in place to reduce the risk of lead exposures. Somebody was asking about lead in drinking water. Obviously, we've banned the use of that. We've stopped using lead solder on food cans. We have almost removed all of the lead from our gasoline. We've got regulations for dust and soil. We've got work practices for the renovation world. And we also have the lead in construction standard, which is the OSHA standard for our worker protection. And we control our waste. So whenever we do work on a site, all of the waste that we generate becomes regulated waste. And we have to test our waste stream to determine how do you dispose of it. We want to make sure that all the lead that we're taking out of these properties doesn't get back into our drinking water and into our soils. So we have a process in place through RCRA, which is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, where we have to perform a TCLP or TCLIP. It stands for Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure. And we basically test it to see how much lead is leaching out of that and may get back into our drinking water supply. Now, again, we have to try and make these rules as financially feasible as possible for our homeowners. And so we do have an exclusion for target housing and child occupied facilities where, excuse me, any debris from a target house is exempt. If it comes from a child occupied facility or a commercial industrial, then they must categorize that waste stream and then handle it appropriately. And then here is that drinking water regulation that somebody was asking about. We do have one. The level of concern for lead in drinking water is 15 parts per billion. We do require public water supplies to monitor their lead levels. This is not something that is typically done as part of a routine lead inspection. Lead in drinking water is typically only looked at maybe as part of an EBL investigation. Whenever we do them in our industry, in our company, it's typically part of a real estate transaction where somebody is concerned, they're aware, they want to know if it's in there. And so we test 3 different draws of the water. A first draw to test if it's coming from the faucet head itself. A second draw allows us to determine if it's coming from the piping within the home. And then we let the water run for a long period of time and we take a third draw, and that third draw tells us if it's coming from the public drinking water supply system. One quick note about EBLs and the consideration to lower this level is a story of a young boy that we worked with a couple of years ago. We got a call from his mom. Now, keeping in mind too, that the current definition of an EBL that Christy was saying is 1 test at 20 micrograms or 2 consecutive between 15 and 19. That's how we define an EBL. This boy was 8 years old. He was mentally handicapped as a direct relation to long-term lead exposure. But every time he was getting tested, his numbers were coming up somewhere around the 8 micrograms per deciliter level. And they couldn't figure out what was happening to him. We spent months following this little guy. We tested his house, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, the school, playgrounds, pots, pans, makeup, I mean, candy, all of the things that you've seen today that may contain lead, that may be sources, and we couldn't find anything. And after several months of dealing with this and several months of working with his medical team, it was discovered that it was his own body, that he had such a high body burden. He had so much lead stored in his body from his long-term exposure as a little one, that as he was growing, his body was releasing that lead back into his system. And so he was effectively self-poisoning himself. This is very similar to what might happen to a woman who had a high exposure to lead as a young woman or as a little kid. When she becomes pregnant, her body thinks that she needs iron, and she may have some lead stored in her body. So she releases that lead and she can poison an unborn child. So that body burden consideration is really important when we look at exposures to kids when they're young. And lowering the level to 5 would give a greater, we would intervention sooner than waiting until these kids are at 15 to 20 micrograms per deciliter. And that's something that Chrissy's program is doing a fantastic job at. They have a great infrastructure in place already. She's got a great training program, initial training. She's got a great refresher training within her program that does a great job at focusing on EBL investigations. They have the extra instruments to go out there and do these inspections. They have the relationship with the labs for the paint chip analysis. Their team is obviously very dedicated to what they're doing. And as she was showing you, they have enforcements. So the infrastructure we have in place already to back up the increase in the numbers of kids that we're going to identify by lowering this number to 5 as red flags. And we also have there's also a great source at the Office of Lead Hazard Control in Healthy Homes. That website is a great source for exposure to lead outside of homes. That's where you can get a lot of information and education on the toys and the pots and pans and the pots and pans and clay pots and medications. That's a great educational resource. And so one thing I just wanted to kind of throw out there was, if Georgia decides to lower this level to 5, like CDC recommends, making sure that we have the funding available to get the Department of Public Health to accomplish the task. We're going to be taking this number and reducing it drastically all the way down to 5. We're going to see an increase in the number of kids. We need to identify those kids. So it's a great idea, but making sure that we've got the support needed to get out there and test all the houses. I think lead-based paint poisoning is a much greater concern in our community than we might realize. And that's all that I have for my presentation. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Do we have any questions? Yes, Representative Maynard.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I do have a question. I know that this study is about children, and just as a physical therapist that works with persons that are considered elderly, and the first meeting we had, it talked about the dangers of lead association to the brain and just neural matters. Do you think Georgia should also be looking at the exposure of lead to the senior population?
I think that lead-based paint is an accumulative effect, right? So what happens when you get lead into your system, especially when you're developing as a small child, is it interrupts the central nervous system. It interrupts the cognitive development. And so once the damage is done to that cognitive development in children, our bodies don't go back and reverse and say, oh, we need to go back and fix what went wrong. Lead-based paint blocks a lot of that development. So by the time we're adults and elderly, a lot of that development obviously is already done. Where we're seeing an increase in the elderly community now is not so much from housing, but we're seeing it a lot from their body burden. they were exposed and or poisoned when they were younger. And as you get older, your body breaks down, osteoporosis, iron deficiencies, and that lead is released into the body. And we are seeing a very high increase of lead poisoning in the elderly community, but it's coming from their person. It's not coming from their environment. So I still think that focusing on kids is the key. Absolutely. But lead testing of anybody at any age obviously is a good idea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? Not seeing any. Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I know we're all learning so much and we have so much more to learn as well. I believe this is our last presentation for today. We will be looking at some dates in October to schedule 2 more meetings out and make sure to get that information to you as well. I encourage all of you to continue to explore. I know there's a lot of information in here. I know we're maybe concerned about some of the things in our own homes, but actually too, just to really continue to read and explore. And if you do have questions, let us know. Tara is always so good to channel those. And it may be something that you are concerned about also could be part of this 3rd or 4th meeting coming up. So if there are no further questions, then we are adjourned for today. And I thank all of you.